In the early 1400s, sometime in around there. It's hard to exactly put a date to it specifically, but from what I've seen and researched, the apple cider industry more or less started in the 1400s, and it was more or less used to preserve a fruit that was no good for eating. So early apples were not very tasty. They kind of didn't have the kind of sugar content that we currently see in apples. America has been producing cider since its foundation and since the first settlers arrived and planted the first seeds. So the American cider industry is something that stretches to the roots of America. We kind of continue that tradition here nowadays because we actually are producing hard cider as well. Sweet cider wasn't a thing. People didn't drink it when it was fresh. It wasn't very tasty originally because those apples hadn't been cultivated yet to be tasty for just straight eating. So you had to go through the fermentation process to make that cider usable. The fresh cider industry, that is actually something that I think is probably relatively new, probably the last 70 or 80 years. It would be my guesstimation, 1900s and on, because we've had the sanitary conditions to keep the apples clean beforehand to where you could produce a beverage that you could keep relatively stable for at least a week. Before that, it was going to start fermenting within that period of time because we didn't have cooling methods to preserve the cider. So fresh cider is relatively new. Everybody has the experience of going out to a small farm and pressing a gallon of cider on a little tiny wooden contraption that was more or less developed after models that early settlers would have used. Apples were carried across America by Johnny Appleseed and others, more or less for the sole purpose of making cider, because cider was one of those beverages that would last all year. You could, if you prepared it properly and then stored it properly, you could be drinking it come March or April when your food stores were getting really low, and it would be sanitary because of the alcohol content. Here at Los Rios, we've been pressing cider since we took over the operation. We've been producing hard cider since I think it was 2016 that we started dabbling in our experimental batches. And the cider industry is growing. We're kind of seeing a revival of it. So Los Rios has just one standard blend of more or less 5 different apples at a time. Our cider has tart apples, sweet apples mixed in. We try to keep the proportions relatively stable so that the cider comes out with a consistent flavor without it being overly sweet or overly tart. If you pressed a whole bunch of Granny Smith apples, you're going to get a really tart cider. We've got 32 different varieties. As varieties are ripening and as we run out of certain varieties, we switch to others. So sweet cider starts off as whole apples that come off of the trees either by accident or on purpose. Take them, put them through a sanitary bath where they get washed, and we rinse off any debris and then sanitize the outside of the apples so that we're starting from a clean slate. Those apples then are broken down into tiny pieces in a small press, the size that you'd get to use at a farm like ours. You're going to be grinding up maybe a bushel of apples through a grinding unit that's powered by your arm, and it's got little tiny metal teeth. Chews off the apples, produces what they call a pumice that comes out the bottom, a bunch of little chunks of apple. And then what you do is then you wrap that pumice in a bag. For the presses that the public gets to use, those bags are a really large mesh cheesecloth. In a small hand press, you have a wooden cage that helps keep the pressure and keep the apples together underneath the press. Pressure is applied to all of the pumice inside, and it also holds the bag closed and allows just the cider to escape out the sides. So that's the basic process of making fresh apple cider. So come be a part of our fall tradition, continue your family tradition, or make a new one. Come on up, try the cider. If you've got the muscle and the time, make your own. It's a fun experience even if you just do it once to experience it. It'll be well worth the visit. You'll be taking part in American history and a continuing process that's gone on every fall since America was founded. Join us. We'll be offering U-Press cider every weekend from one of our many locations here on the mountain, and we'll have hard cider available for tasting at least 2 of the locations. We'll have it for sale also at those locations. So come on up.